Hello.
Hello, Jamie. Is that a real background or is that a fabricated background?
It is. Here, I'll show you.
Oh, he's really there. He's not running into a Google background. Oh, look at you. That's so cool.
It's a real background. Finally, something that looks nice, right? It doesn't look like a prepper's basement.
Blink once if you need someone to rescue you.
Someone, those of you that have been watching video and see Peter's nice background of our podcast and Jamie's ever-changing background from
I know. I need to run a note to send you back.
prepper's garage to public library to now our house in Lake Tahoe, which, what's the book? It could always be worse.
So funny.
Yeah.
Let's see here. We had Adam Swinyard this week.
We did have Adam Swinyard this week. When did you first interview Adam Swinyard?
That's a good question. A couple of years ago, I think he was in maybe second season.
I'm excited. I was excited to listen to it. This is, it's interesting. Were Greg and I season 2? Yeah, we were on season 2 and you had Adam season 2.
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but it's like anytime I listen to this conversation, for which I'm super excited for guests to listen to, because he gets into this rhythm about public education and you can't help but to say, like, put me in, coach. Where do you want me to be? I'll go do anything.
Yeah.
It's just this promise that we make to people around public education, which couldn't be even more important than ever based on the fact that right now in our nation, there's news of $6 billion being pulled from public schools, that after school programs, that all these absolutely necessary safety nets to allow families to do their thing so that schools can support kids. And I don't even know where to go. It's probably not the way you want to begin, but it's very much like a dystopian novel at this point. It's like, what is happening? And so I hear Adam, and I hope that those who listen will hear him talk about, he'll talk about the pandemic and their work. He'll talk about really the promise that we make to families and to communities and the promise of public education. And if that doesn't get you motivated, I don't know what will.
I mean, it fits right in with our approach, or my approach, our organizational approach around that public schools aren't public until they serve everyone. And that, that's his thought. I really enjoyed some of the ways in which he talked about leadership, particularly systems leadership, which you guys sort of dig deep into. So let's listen to Adam and circle back and talk about systems leadership.
Let's do it. Yeah. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Monson.
And we're so glad you're here. All right, we'll see you in a minute. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Adam Swinyard is my guest. Adam has experiences at all levels. He taught at the elementary and high school levels. He's been a middle school principal, an associate superintendent, and since 2020, he's been the superintendent of the Spokane Public Schools in Spokane, Washington. And Dr. Swinyard was recognized as the 2023 Washington State Superintendent of the Year. So Adam, welcome to An Imperfect Leader and congratulations on your recognition.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
So Adam, I've always said that there's a special place in heaven for anyone who has worked as a kindergarten teacher or as anything in a middle school. And as I've learned more about you, recognitions for excellence are not new to you. One in particular caught my eye. I saw the AERA, the American Education Research Association, that they awarded you with the Research on Superintendency Dissertation of the Year Award. And that's really a tremendous honor. AERA is quite an intellectual group of folks. And I wonder, would you tell us just a little bit about your dissertation topic, what you learned, and how that learning has influenced you as a leader?
Yeah, so my dissertation focus was really centered around organizational learning, extent to which educational entities engage in that type of practice, and leverage to the greatest extent possible a systems thinking approach as the organization is learning about itself. So my dissertation centered around steps that principals can take to turn their school into a learning organization, that they are tapping in and fostering an awareness of the attributes of a high-performing school, of which there are a range of theoretical models, some 7 attributes of a high-performing school, 10 or 12. There's a number of different theoretical models out there. And the dissertation was more about not a particular theoretical construct of high-performing schools, but the extent to which the principal has identified a construct and then is seeking to be continually learning about the prevalence of those attributes inside of their school, whether that's through informal conversations or more formal structures like a staff and student and family perception survey. And so, really about leaders fostering a sense of an awareness and an understanding of the context in which they serve, and recognizing the interconnectivity between a myriad of factors that play into whether or not a school is successful, whether that's a sense of safety or academic expectations or shared decision making, aspects of morale and joyfulness, whatever those attributes are. How is the principal being attentive to those things and seeking to leverage, systems change, recognizing that those variables interact with each other and there isn't one singular variable that would necessarily translate into the success of their school. That it's the ecosystem of variables that makes the difference.
So that's interesting. I mean, you could look at Peter Senge's work, you could look at all these other sort of system thinking experts. And one of the things that they certainly talk about, and you have just referenced, is the connectedness between and among systems, internally within your system, externally, those that are influencing you. To some extent, superintendents or principals have control over certain parts of the system and others they don't. And I'm kind of curious, were you looking at a particular school? Were you looking at a particular set of schools? And what was something that you learned from that you took to your own role as a leader?
Yeah, so the instrument that I used for my dissertation was evaluating the extent to which principals utilize some type of survey to monitor the attributes of a high-performing school inside of their district. And then was there a correlation between the school's academic performance and the principal's use of that particular type of approach?
Are you saying something like, so you might do a Likert scale or something like that, where you're asking people, do you somewhat agree or disagree? And then wondering whether or not, if there is psychological safety in that school, how did that compare to how students were actually performing, or looking at attendance of kids or attendance of adults or those types of things?
Yeah. And so the dissertation instrument was about whether or not the principal was engaged in that type of behavior. Whether do you annually distribute a survey to your staff? Do you incorporate the results of that survey in your school improvement planning? What type of attributes are you measuring or variables are you measuring inside of those surveys? And so the dissertation was about, do principals who engage in that type of practice, do their schools perform at higher levels than principals that don't? And there was a statistically significant finding in my particular study. Principals that are engaged in organizational learning, their schools demonstrate a higher level of performance. Oftentimes, and this is true not just in education, but it crosses sectors. We organizations can sometimes fall into a pattern of relying on the most simplistic approach. And in education, we usually attribute deficiencies in performance historically. I think, although this is starting to evolve much more, particularly post-pandemic, is the problem must be related to curriculum, instruction, or assessment. And if we change something relative to curriculum, instruction, or assessment, then the school's performance would improve. And I love that. My favorite analogy to this example of this is actually not related to education, but I think it's very concrete. That let's say that you're the CEO of a tech company. You have a monopoly on the market. You have the product that no one else has. You have the best product. There's no reason that you should be worried about any of your competitors. And so your particular company, your product goes onto the market, sales spike, you're making lots of money, moving lots of product, and then all of a sudden you see this dip in sales. Typically, when businesses have a dip in sales, what do? They lower prices and they market more. And so the business lowers prices and they market more, and then sales then go up again. Well, then subsequently, then they dip back down. There's this other peak and valley. And so when the business engages in organizational learning, what they might learn is it really has nothing to do with the price point. It really has nothing to do with the marketing, but the fluctuation in sales was really an issue with the business's distribution center. And there wasn't enough capacity in distribution, that when sales came up and demand for product went up, then the distribution center became overwhelmed, couldn't deliver in a timely way on the product, and then customers got frustrated and stopped buying it.
For those who like system thinking, he's referencing a stock and flow map. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So I like talking to school and school leaders around that example, because I think sometimes it's helpful to step outside of our current context and think about problems in other settings, and then try to come back and apply them. And so I often share that example with principals and then talk about, how much time are you spending in your school improvement planning process about curriculum, assessment, and instruction? What data are you looking at? We have an elementary in our school district that has 50% of the kids are chronically absent. They have very strong core instruction. Lots of great things are going on in the classroom. When we disaggregate their data, what we find is when the students come to school, their growth is pretty significant. So the focus of that school improvement plan likely should be centered around supporting families, supporting students to make sure that they have a higher level of attendance. That's just unfortunately antithetical to maybe where we've been in K-12, that we have put a lot of emphasis, and understandably so, around curriculum assessment and instruction, but there are other variables that are accounting for the variance and the differences in results. And unless we're engaged in organizational learning, we may not unearth those.
I love this conversation. I will move on to another piece of the conversation, although I'll leave you with one thought I was having was, as you were talking about kids who are chronically absent, there are also those schools where there is a constant turnover of teachers. And so while you may have the most effective curricular plan, scope, sequence, great instructional models, but you're perpetually training people to learn them, then you're not seeing the kind of results. And then you sometimes get that Mozart effect, sort of. You have a rotating or revolving door of superintendents. And so the district is constantly having a new person who then says, well, we're going to use this program. And there's sort of this initial spike of achievement or progress, and then it dips again. So as you were talking through the stock flow map, there's so many pieces to that. And we quite frankly don't get that kind of training when we're going through our programs. At least that was not my experience, in terms of thinking not just about that one data point and what does that mean for curriculum instruction, but all the pieces of the system and our practices. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there is a dimension called leaders learning work. And that's really the mind or brains of an organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term using the power of language. And in learning more about you, you really appear to apply the power of language. So story, you just framing, metaphor, the example that you just gave in terms of the tech company, stepping outside of the educational realm and using another scenario as a way to frame a situation, casting an image for others. What does a shared image look like? And so I get a sense that you really do apply the power of language to accomplish what can really be tough nuts to crack. So as a leader, how do you use language, things like scenario building, to help others arrive at that shared image of what success looks like?
Yeah, well, I think there's never been a time in the history of public education where it's more important for us to tell the story and tell the story about the great things happening inside of our schools. And, we talk a lot in our district around we need more mirrors, windows, and doors. We need mirrors for kids to see themselves in the curriculum, see themselves in the adults that are working with them. We need windows for kids to see out into the world, and we need windows for our families and our community to see in, see what it looks like, and see the joyfulness, see the activities. I always laugh with people that, in our culture, it has not become uncommon for people to put cameras inside of their homes because they love their pets so much. They want to see what their pet's doing during the day. And, our culture has changed. Our families, they want to see what their kids are doing during the day. They want to have that shared experience. That's become an expectation of our culture, that you can see and feel and touch spaces that maybe you're not physically in. And so we really pushed ourselves to think about that. And then to have doors that kids can go out into our community, but also our district belongs to the community we serve, and people should be able to come in and be a real active participant. So I think the first thing comes to my mind when you say that is telling our story and providing mirrors, windows, and doors is really important. And I totally agree. 10, 15, 20 years ago, where people received their information was so much more narrow. When I was growing up, my dad, he read the paper. That's where a lot of his worldview, a lot of his sense making, a lot of his awareness of current events came from the morning newspaper.
And if you were special, you had the set of encyclopedias in your house. And if your parents were paying for it month by month, you may have only had A through L for a while until they had enough money to get the rest of the alphabet.
Yeah, exactly. So you have this, this very narrow sources of information. Well, now you've got this explosion of places that people get their information. They might get it from the newspaper, but there could be 100 or so websites they get it from. They could be social media they might get it from. There's all these different TV stations and streamings and documentation. There's this explosion of all these different places people can take in and develop their own perceptions and worldviews. And so we have a lot to compete with. And there's only so many opportunities to really capture attention and to tell the story. So I do think it's more important than ever that we're thoughtful about the structures we're leveraging to do that, but also the way, and to your point, language and telling stories and giving examples and being really clear and trying to foster coherence around what it looks like to be in a public school and what the mission of public school is and why it's so important and why it's so relevant is really critical. I've actually spent a lot of time reading literature about the business sector and how the business sector talks about ideas, and, Make It Stick is a really popular one that a lot of people have read. And I've read it 2 or 3 times just because I think it's so relevant that intentionality around communication has to be so strategic now in a way that those demands are just greater than ever because there's so much to compete with.
Adam, I ask this question of every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, I love that term because I really feel like in this current moment, one of the most important attributes of a leader is to be human and to be vulnerable and to be deeply committed to getting it right over being right. And I think, unfortunately, for a litany of reasons, a lot of people in our community across the country, the stereotype they carry of a leader is antithetical to someone who's human, who's vulnerable, makes mistakes. And I think that has created a level of separation and, unfortunately, maybe a level of mistrust that has not allowed us to go as far and as fast as maybe we could. So I spend a lot of time trying to be very open and very vulnerable about mistakes, where we've gone wrong as a school district, where we need to get better. My job is to tell the story, and the story can't be authentic unless you're telling the best parts and celebrating the great things, but also recognizing and acknowledging that we have a long ways to go. And we will say sorry, and we will apologize, and we will own it when we've done wrong. And I think, unfortunately, school districts have built a lot of walls and they've taken a defensive posture. And that happens because of, litigation and critique and, lots of different reasons. But I think in the long run, a defensive posture and a lack of transparency and a lack of openness and willingness to acknowledge what's imperfect actually creates more distrust, more frustration, more public comment at school board meetings, more angry emails, more civil rights complaints, versus getting in a room and saying, I am so sorry. I tell our leaders all the time, sorry, apologies are free. They don't cost anything. And that's an important part of being in a relationship and being in community with each other. And if we aren't willing to do that, then it's going to be really difficult for us to partner with the people that we serve, whether that's staff, families, and kids. Like, kids need to see adults model that they're not perfect and that they make mistakes. And we need to model for them what it looks like to say they're sorry and to ask for forgiveness and to try to pursue the win-win. And I think that is, at least in my journey, that has been antithetical to some of the draconian culture of public education.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership and After Action. My guest today is Adam Swinyard, Superintendent of Schools in Spokane, Washington. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make and discuss. So, Adam, what happened?
Yeah, well, it's not hard when I engage in reflection to quickly get situated in some point of the pandemic, just because it was so dynamic and it was so unprecedented and there were so many opportunities for new learning. And as awful as that experience was for so many, I do think that there's good fruit and there's good learning for us to derive from it. And our district took a very consistent approach in a community that was very divided around following guidance of our local public health officials. And we just, we're very steadfast that, no matter what, we're going to do what our local public health officials said.
Yeah, well, while you have your doctorate, I mean, could you imagine they say, so are you an epidemiologist? No. Are you a virologist? No. Are you an infectious disease expert? No. So you felt like you could do something different from what your health department was saying? Well, yeah. I mean, so anyway, sorry. I'm going to use this as my own therapy from being a superintendent during a pandemic. So I'll try not to interrupt, but yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and that was, and our message was really consistent. Like, we have 30,000 kids and 6,000 employees, and we have always followed the guidance of public health officials as a core principle for keeping our staff and our students safe. That's always how we've operated our school district. We've never deviated from that, and we're not going to start doing that. So whatever public health officials say, that's what we're going to do. And there were moments of the pandemic where that really frustrated individuals that wanted more significant safety measures and precautions in place. And there were moments of the pandemic where that really frustrated open school advocates, because at one juncture we were full distance learning. And then, we ended up being the largest district in the state with the most kids in classrooms participating in person instruction. So we had points in time where both perspectives were challenged by that public health approach. And so I think my learning and my takeaway from that was, when you're in a crisis, it's really important to try to look back on and reflect on what have we historically done? Is there anything about our historical practice that we can apply to this moment? And not all of it's applicable, because there's obviously some pretty enormous differences to what COVID presented to us. But then to be able to be very consistent and very clear into the rationale. And as I had lots and lots of conversations, what I think helped us move forward in a way that didn't further polarize a really polarized situation was being able to be really consistent, really clear, and to be able to explain the why. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you making these decisions? And we were steadfast, never wavered. I have a single school board member that ever wavered. I never wavered. It was the same consistent message every single step of the way. And I think at the end of the day, although there were, again, points in time where people were really frustrated, I think ultimately it fostered a lot of trust, because in a crisis like that, and I think in many crises, one of the most detrimental impacts to how people are feeling in those moments is a loss of control. Like the world doesn't make sense anymore. I can't control the situation. And being able to predict what's going to happen next intersects with feeling in control. If I can predict what's coming next, then I feel like I have some sense of control and the world is in some semblance of order. And so by being really consistent and being really clear, even though people didn't agree, I think it helped lower some of the emotion out of it, because then we became predictable. So every time there was going to be a state announcement, or every time there was going to be an update from our state Department of Health, people in the community basically are like, well, we don't have to wonder if our school district is going to send kids back, or if our kid's going to, close schools again, because whatever the Department of Health says, that's exactly what Spokane Public. So they were able to start predicting our behavior, and the predictability fostered trust, even when there wasn't agreement. And so I learned a lot of how important it is as a leader to be clear about what you believe, be clear about your why, and then be consistent in your messaging and the language that you're using. And I mean, I literally used the same words and the same type of email. I mean, I was actually thinking the other day, like, I just used to spend all day Saturday responding to emails, and I personally responded to every single email I received. But the language was very similar, and that consistency was really important.
It has to be. You know that they're sharing your responses widely. And to your point about earlier, your dad got his information from the newspaper. Now everyone's getting their information lots of different ways and lots of different platforms on social media. And so how do you make sure that your message remains consistent? Because the moment it deviates or shifts in any sort of way, now he's saying something different. So that's really interesting. When you look at, the pandemic is a really large topic to talk about, and you could break it down into, the virtual learning or distance learning as full distance learning, as you described it, or masks, or what does hybrid look like, or what does food distribution or technology look like? So there are lots of different subparts to the pandemic. Are there pieces, as you now look back, that you felt as a system, not you individually, but as a system, got overlooked?
I'm not sure I would use the word overlooked. I think what I would say is the ability to anticipate how people are going to respond when they're in crisis, almost impossible. And so you may have employees that are usually very level, very pragmatic, and they were just inconsolable and erratic in kind of how they're moving through the world.
That's interesting. So systems thinkers do consider the different perspectives that people bring to a scenario. And that's interesting from the perspective, and I hadn't thought about this, is that when you're making decisions, you often anticipate how are different people going to react to this. And yet this was unprecedented, and people were scared, and they're seeing images. And quite frankly, the pandemic sort of started in Seattle and in New York. And so the rest of the nation was sort of watching what was happening in Washington State and New York State and trying to come to some conclusions about, well, is it going to come here or is it not going to come here? Those types of things. And so anticipating how people are going to behave was difficult. And I can't say that as a superintendent leading in that time, I took a step back to say, how are our people, how is their fear and anxiety going to manifest in such a way? And what are some things that we can do as a system to sort of meet their needs? Is that what you're sort of referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what I'm referencing. And, usually we develop where we anticipate how people are going to respond based upon what we know about them and their pattern of behavior. And that's what made it so challenging, is the pattern of someone's behavior historically was not necessarily predictive on how they were going to feel and behave during the pandemic. What resulted from that I think already aligned really closely with my values and what I believe about leadership, but it deeply reinforced it, is how important it is to be able to be in spaces with people and listen to them. And just the ability, the humanity of feeling heard and listened to. And we had some really intense school board meetings that were pretty dynamic in nature. And what I started doing about halfway through the pandemic, again, this is kind of back to not taking a defensive posture. As soon as the meeting was over, I would get up and I would walk into the middle of the room and I would just stand in the middle of the room. And, some people said, maybe not super kind things and then would walk out the door. But inevitably, every meeting I'd be standing there and there'd be 15 or 20 people circled around me. And I would just stand there and listen to them and talk to them.
You made yourself accessible.
Yeah. And in that I think helped us turn that type of behavior, helped us move through without further polarizing and kind of harming relationships in a way that in maybe other places, they're still trying to work their way back because some of the relationships and trust were so significantly ruptured.
What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Well, what I learned specific to relationships and leaders is, and this is, again, something that I've always believed, but the pandemic really pushed us to think deeply about it. An example is we had a number of principal openings from my tenure for retirements and pandemic and just all sorts of different reasons. We have 56 schools, and every year we usually, year in, year out, decades, usually 4 or 5, 6 openings. But we've had a pretty significant number of principals come into our system, and we completely redesigned and reimagined our principal hiring process. And we developed it all exclusively around emotional intelligence. And so we screen for emotional intelligence. We ask interview questions about emotional intelligence. When we get feedback in forums, we're looking to get feedback on people's perception of the candidate's emotional intelligence, because everything orbits around relationships, whether it's a labor dynamic or a coalition building dynamic or a student dynamic or a race dynamic. Everything orbits around relationships. And so leaders that have an astute ability to understand their own emotions and be aware of their own emotions, and to be able to interpret verbal and nonverbal emotions of others, and then make leadership decisions based on their ability to interpret those things, is invaluable to almost everything a leader does. And what's really interesting is the profile of the human being that you select when you are recruiting and hiring for emotional intelligence. It's a different profile of human being. They have less years of experience. They have less degrees. They have less certifications. They don't have some of the characteristics that we would maybe historically associate with somebody who is ready to be a principal. But they are amazingly successful in leading their schools. And then they need some support because they maybe don't have as many years of experience, that they make some technical mistakes, or in some cases, they make a lot of technical mistakes. And what we've decided is that we're going to invest in building a leadership group that has very high emotional intelligence, and then we can teach them and train them around the technical details. But the extent to which you can teach emotional intelligence is obviously much more complex than how to submit their annual budget. And not that you can't, and not that you can't nurture it, but that is a decision that was directly derived from our realization during the pandemic. What principals are doing the best navigating this with their staff, and it was the ones that had very high emotional intelligence.
What frustrated you?
What frustrates me maybe the most, and this is not just a pandemic thing, is I am somebody that believes unapologetically in the dream of public education. I believe in the dream that no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter what your background is, there is hope for you to be happy and successful through public education. And I believe in that dream. I think it sits at the core of who we are as a country and our journey. The dream is not fulfilled. We're not there yet, but the dream in and of itself is so virtuous and is so American and is so worthwhile of us investing in to realize that I really struggle with disappointment when I see messages and narratives that sensationalize the challenges and the failures of public education. And I'll be the first one to admit we have lots of things to success. And I've got a great elevator speech about Spokane Public Schools. And there's some very real improvements that need to be made. And there's some really significant failures. And I think confronting those and talking about those are really important. But when I see an attempt for either attention seeking or profit or for the number of clicks, when I see things sensationalized, that I'm very troubled by that.
You know, using the pandemic as a way to, since you're in the seat and have to be careful about how you talk about it, although I think you've been really forthright, using public education and the pandemic as a way to continue this campaign for what is considered a reform. So vouchers or any other way that one might divert monies for public education and diverting it toward private entities is an absolute assault on public education. And I have never heard it so beautifully stated in terms of the promise that we make, the contract we have with our families and our communities to provide them the very best education. And you're continuously working to improve. That is not a reason to raise a white flag on the most important institution in our country.
Yeah, no, Spokane Public Schools, we are the only public school system in the state of Washington that is a charter authorizer. And so we have 2 charter schools that we authorize. We have a strong parochial system. In fact, we have a parochial school in our community that's renting one of our facilities. I'm a strong supporter that we should be exploring different options, as long as we are all entering into those spaces, being very open and authentic around the successes, the importance, the failures of all aspects of K-12 education.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about authentic and genuine partnerships as opposed to 2 independent systems that are engaged in parallel play, and where one is sort of punished and the other only accepts certain kids. And I was interviewing a leader in Baltimore, Maryland charter school. They are a neighborhood school. There isn't preferential who gets in, who doesn't get in. And that is a very different system than what you see in some other states where there are 2 different tracks and one doesn't even have to report its state assessments, or it's not used as any part of their accreditation. And so those are problematic.
Yeah. And what I continue to center on is, again, I think there's a space and a value of options, but we shouldn't be pushing one road down to lift the other up. We should talk about the attributes, both good and bad, of all the different types of educational options in K-12. We should be open and authentic and honest about the merits and the setbacks of both, but the failures of one should not be sensationalized for any reason.
Right. Neither system should be vilified as a way to promote the success of the other.
So, that's why I just think it's really important to tell the story of public education, and we should have open, honest conversations around, the different structures and different options that have been created. And let's have that open, honest conversation. But to sensationalize or demonsterize one particular option, I think is really unfortunate, given the significant role that public education has played in our country's success.
Well said. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of your experience?
So many things.
I love the fact that as you are recruiting great leaders, that emotional intelligence has played a sizable role in how you recruit now. That's different from what I've heard others talk about, and that's really impressive. I wonder what else has been a positive that has come out of this.
I think I'm so hopeful for the future. The pandemic was really hard, and it fractured a lot of things and a lot of relationships and a lot of families. And we're still standing and we're still moving forward. And I am more hopeful for who we are as a country and who we are as a people. And our systems and structures are not perfect, but but they can see us through really hard times and really tough things. And there's still some harm and some repair that needs to happen. And there's probably lots of important conversations on all sorts of levels, but it did make me so optimistic around who we are as a people, and to see the community come together and to see us supporting each other, and to see frontline workers going to work every day and teachers going into classroom. We had special education teachers that they never left our schools. There was no distance learning for them. They never left. They never stepped away from being next to their kids, supporting them and the needs that they had. So I really think the pandemic, although it surfaced some things that were ugly, I do think it demonstrated all the best values, all the best characteristics of who we are as a people. And I think sometimes we lose a little sight of that. We lose a little sight of, you know what, at the end of the day, we got through it. We can go through hard things and we'll learn from them and we'll be better because of them. But there's a lot to be proud of. And I hope I hope when history looks back on that moment, I hope that is the preeminent story. Not
a community coming together, so that it wasn't just a moniker of we are one, we're in this together, united, all of those types of things. You actually were living that, and you got to see incredible examples in and outside the system of support for children, families. We know that the pandemic exposed so many of the inequities that already existed within our communities. And what I think I hear you saying is, and we did something about it.
And people stood up, and we served over almost 2 million meals during the pandemic. I mean, we had people, out every day walking the streets, knocking on doors, checking on kids, making sure they had what they need. I mean, the extent to how people showed up to be there for one another, pretty amazing.
My guest again was Adam Swinyard. Adam, when they were awarding you the Superintendent of the Year award, the Washington State Association of School Administrators made note of your efforts to not just promote equitable practices, but to pursue those efforts with, quote, fierce commitment. Talking with you today has made it very clear why you were their choice. Thank you for your commitment to children, for sharing your words with superintendents across our nation and in the 20 countries who have subscribed to this podcast. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Okay, we're back. What a great conversation with Adam Swinyard. I'm going to leave it to you first if you've got some thoughts, your own takeaways. So take it away.
A previous guest, former Superintendent Marlon Stiles, talked about overwhelm with the positive. And even though that's not how Dr. Swinyard talked about his work, I see an overlap here. And he basically said, you asked as a leader, how do you use language? And so I will say this question is better than the post-it of why didn't you ask? So the Jamie post-it of why didn't you ask? This
question can go away. So what is my new?
No, it doesn't go away. I actually have something connected to that too. About it going away. There's no go away. But I loved this question. And so my question to you is, how do you use language? What is the approach to the use of language that you would give as a mentor to young superintendents?
Oh, I love it. So I would say the power of language in lots of different ways. One, you create meaning or create clarity when you use things like metaphor as a way to sort of help. I believe that scenario building is super helpful as you are working through potential issues, or when you're working towards convenings, bringing people together. When you do some scenario building together, it will get you to that question of what do we want to create together? And using a story, using symbols. So story to really hammer home a value or an ideal can be so much more helpful than a more sort of didactic declaration. This is what we're doing, as opposed to here's a story, or here's an example. I think in a previous conversation, we talked about being the town crier, right? And so by using story, you're emphasizing what you value in a way that highlights the good work of others. And so it becomes less of this top-down coaching for compliance sort of approach, and really leveraging story, scenario building, metaphor, those types of things. And so Adam used metaphor in a really, I thought, important way. I've heard people talk about mirrors, and I've heard them talk about windows and things like that, but he really talked about we need more mirrors, windows, and doors. And he didn't stop there. He started to say mirrors, so students see themselves, windows, so that communities can see into the school, which is so new for me. I hadn't even thought about sort of I always saw it as like one-way windows out of the school where kids could see possibilities outside. And he
Yeah.
was flipping it and saying, oh, no, I wanted a two-way mirror so that people can see the good things that are happening within your buildings. And then, of course, doors for students to go out and the community to come in. And so that's a great example, I thought, of using language.
I loved it. Your explanation there makes me think of one of my favorite pieces of advice you have given to other superintendents, and that is the give out free passes to the football games, to the choir performances, to the whatever, the universal pass. I just love this idea.
And I can't claim ownership of that. My mentor, Linda Henke, said, Peter, I took over a school district that was 1 point from being unaccredited. And when I left 13 years later, we were 99 out of 100 points. And one way was that from the very beginning, I said, we've got to engage a community that had been voting against its schools.
Right.
They had, right? I mean, they were told, vote no on the bonds, vote no on the levies, find alternatives to these schools. You don't want your kids here. Yet she's walking around and seeing some brilliant things happening in a lot of ways. Some other things that she thought
Amplify the positive, right? Once again, amplify the positive over and over again. And so that's the example of the window in. That's a great example of a concrete, clear action step of a window in. I also thought early in the conversation with Adam, the metaphor that he uses of the tech company, I was like, this guy's a geek. This guy's a complete geek.
And you loved it.
Oh, well, let's take an example of, I was like, I know which stock charts you're talking about. I know how this works.
Oh, the stock flow. Yeah.
The stock flow. I was like, oh my God.
He was an AERA Dissertation of the Year award recipient.
Well, I want to get to that. I definitely want to get to that, to his research. But the thing that I thought was interesting related to the metaphor that he uses here in relation to the tech company was it leads to the purpose of any coach's work, so my work, but anybody who's supporting schools, and that what we want schools to be able to do for ourselves, which is difficult to do when you're in it. And that is, who's helping you ask different questions, right? Who's helping you ask? So when they ask questions about curriculum, assessment, and instruction, although I'll probably push on some of that sometimes, I feel like assessment gets lost all the time. And I don't mean like state assessment. I mean, do you know what kids don't know? But we ask those questions a lot. I think we do. So I agree with him there. To get to the attendance question requires someone else helping you think about school performance differently. And I loved that idea. We talk about this all the time. You and I, probably one of the ways in which we vibe the most is like, oh my God, have you seen that school? What about this school? That school did this. Like, we're constantly vibing off of these examples. And this is just yet another example of a school thinking about dealing with school performance. If the kids are there, they do great. I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. So your question isn't about instruction. It's about, well, how do we get kids here? Or even better, let's start and figure out why they don't come, and then what it is that we might be able to provide in order to support them to come.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that. I used to perseverate. So that's why I came up with the term active negative data, because I would perseverate on why don't kids come to school? And I would rather ask, why do they come to school? And then how do we find more opportunities to provide that? So I think a lot of times when you look at schools where kids are actively there, they're coming to school, it's because they've been given choice. There's a sense of belonging. There's a sense of joy. There's respect. I mean, for kids, not respect for the adults. There's respect for the kids, which sort of makes you imagine there's also support between adults and adults to kids. And so then it's, how do you get more of that? How do we get more of that? I mean, so you say a kid comes, look, you may say, yeah, but Peter, if a kid doesn't have reliable transportation, that's why they're not coming to school. So you got to know, what are the barriers to coming to school? Not just, do you feel like you belong?
Right.
Because a kid will be like, yeah, when I'm there, I feel like I belong. But I can't.
I love
get
that place.
I can't.
I love that place. But who knows what this goes to the later in the conversation is after action review around COVID. And I have some thoughts about that too, but you don't know. People are dealing with things that you don't know regularly. Yeah. And that's
so
a question that
maybe it's a flip in terms of talking about language, is to say, to know their stories, right? So, so tell us about every bit about your day on how do you get to school. And it's like, well, I rely on public transit, but it's unreliable. You can start to extrapolate or at least pull out what are the barriers to getting to this place that they love. They love to be there. And so I mean, sometimes I got into slight arguments with like the attendance clerks who would say, we need to send this kid a letter because he's been late 70 times or something. And you're going, but he's getting here every day. Just to get here is a real challenge. We should be celebrating this kid as opposed to sending some sort of menacing letter that says you were late again. And so now we're going to, refer this to the juvenile office or some other nonsense, because that's how sometimes schools who don't take a step back to think about the experience of being a child and the challenges for some families.
And it's how systems work. Systems are set up. And so we create automatic letter. We had Leo out for doctor's appointments or something. And at a certain number of absences, he was out. Oh, also his grandma died. And, so he went to the funeral and the wake. And so, he's been out more days than but it triggered the absence letter. And so we got a letter.
Here's a good example also, if we're personalizing it.
Yeah.
The Jewish holidays are always in September, early October. The two big ones, right? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur, yeah.
And so I would always get a letter also because my kid had missed 2 days of school right at the beginning of the school year. And that's not going to be indicative of how his attendance is going to be the rest of the year. But, oh my gosh, 2 out of the first 8 or 10 days. Whoop, whoop.
All right. So can we switch to his after action review a little bit?
Let's do it.
Okay. I want to actually get to, first of all, I think it was funny. Basically, his after action review was COVID. That was the entirety. Wasn't something necessarily specific. It was just, this is hard. Yes, it was. I particularly enjoyed when he said, it was hard to predict how people would respond.
Well, and he's in a, university town, a real city, as well as it was very much like Columbia. I was there recently and I was like, oh my God, it's like Columbia, Missouri. University town, real city, rural in a lot of ways, and on the Idaho border. And so it's just, So he was really careful about talking about his experience. He's a practicing superintendent. And, but it's great.
I thought, it's fine. The outcome was my favorite part. So his own reflections about the outcome were really great. And what he talked about, he said, what resulted from this? Well, it was already aligned closely with my values and what I believe about leadership, but it reinforced how important it is to be in spaces with people and listen to them. His move from the board sitting on the dais to coming down to the center of the room after the board meeting had closed. This can't emphasize how much these are those simple things. It's here's a laminated pass. Move your body and put your body in the center. Will it all be positive? No, he says, no, I got a lot of negative. But by doing that, I built trust. The physical body, his physical presence in that space, let people feel connected to him.
Yes. I heard him say it and I thought, dang it, why didn't I do that?
So good.
Why didn't I do that more?
It's a basic
somebody would say something and they would leave the room and I would follow and talk to them in the hallway. But I had that was just one-on-one.
Right.
And how meaningful it would be. There's the visual, right? The optics of being able to be seen as available and not detached, as well as the practical of being able to provide people answers in real time that allows people to even see each other as humans.
Because as a board meeting, Robert's Rules of Order is not set to actually build relationship.
Right.
That's
Public comment does not get a response. It's thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And all he's doing is saying, I'm using this structure in order to get some policy decisions done, to debate particular ideas, et cetera. And now we're closed and I'm coming to talk to people. I'm going to listen to some folks, which led to the completely new way, back to asking different questions, new way of analyzing how they interview principals. And it resonated so much for me because Greg and I and our colleague, Dr. Aaron Johnson, are writing a book about principal development and principal support. And I would say a third of the book to 50% of the book is about emotional intelligence. It's pretty much everything. And as someone who goes through getting your principal license has nothing about emotional intelligence, absolutely nothing. And so you come in and you realize, and especially now as a coach of principals, I realize the leaders that are stronger just have more emotional intelligence. They've worked on it.
I totally agree. He says, we can teach them and train them around the technical details. Right?
Totally.
But everything orbits around relationships.
Everything.
I was like, done. Drop mic, walk off. Totally.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote down when he talked about this in relation to emotional intelligence and listening, being a better listener. Being a better listener builds those relationships, or isn't a skill of emotional intelligence, high levels of emotional intelligence. And the two beginning steps that I usually tell leaders to consider. The first, let's say before the first, the pre is move your body. Put your body closer to the people that you want to connect to. Number 2, shut up. Don't talk. That's all you have to do. Literally, just don't talk. If you don't talk, you create more space for other people to talk. That's everything. That's step 1. Step 2, can you slow your brain down, your own emotions that are happening for you, to hear how they experience it differently from you? Just to notice them. You don't have to comment on them. You don't have to, nothing yet. Just notice how they see it differently. Because if you do that, you get this much closer. You get so much closer to their story.
Love it.
So
that was wonderful.
that's it.
That was
Wanna say-
wonderful. I think that actually really complements or stitches nicely to the last thing I wanted to say in terms of Adam's call for championing the dream of public education. So
Yeah.
here's what I wrote down, exactly what he wrote. No matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter what your background is, there is hope for you to be happy and successful through public education. And so I was so moved by that, and I continue to be, particularly now. And so anyone who's listening, I just want you to continue to keep fighting for public education, keep fighting for our kids. And it really is a fight. I hate to say, keep working towards it, but right at this moment in time, it's a fight. And so I think we'll end there for this week, and I will see you next week. And I guess what I would say, this is so silly, but if you do want to make a comment, give us 5 stars, and then tell us what your hope is. What does it mean, championing the dream of public education? What does that mean for you? So I'm going to put that out there in social media this week and just kind of ask people, define it. Let's just get a groundswell of reminding us what we stand for, the promise.
God, I
that we're
love
making.
that.
So
This is
anyway.
This is why we're friends, Peter, because we're both so deeply committed to public education. It's a value. It's an ingrained value of who we are.
The bedrock of everything we believe in. So
Yeah.
Alrighty, Jamie, have a good week. See you next week.
Yeah. See you next week. Bye.